Good day and welcome to COBRA's 10 o'clock daily show. I'm Maurice Crespi. I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys, a co-founder of COBRA. We founded COBRA together with the IQ Business Group, actually now known as IQ Business, and Engaged Business Turnaround. We now have over 40 partners, all contributing on a pro bono basis. They're all committed to provide their services from professional services to financial services to businesses in distress. The pro bono services involve the webinars such as today. They involve a knowledge base on our website, www.cobra.org.za. We also arrange private Zoom sessions with you and your team, if need be, if you want us to ask specific questions. Otherwise, please, today, ask questions. Today's a specific webinar. We'll be dealing with surviving and thriving, the role of the board in the crisis, and why having an effective board just became key. It's going to be presented by Roger Hitchcock of the Sirdar Group. The Sirdar Group are a COBRA partner. They've been very, very generous with their support and the content of the webinar. So thank you once again, Roger, for being here today. Let's introduce my panelists. I have Roger Hitchcock, who's going to be presenting today. Just a bit about him. Roger has worked for over 20 years in both large corporate environments and small business environments. His speciality is making complexity understandable and facilitating robust solutions. He is passionate about assisting companies and individuals to find their clear strategic direction and purpose, and helping them to take steps in implementing this purpose in an effective way. Roger's held a number of directorships, ranging from executive director in Honey Lane Consulting to non-executive positions in the mining sector, retail, and non-profit sectors. Roger leads Sirdar Group education programs and supports Sirdar clients with his strategic and facilitation expertise. He's also an accredited Sirdar independent director. Then we have Gary Barachowitz. Gary is from Schindler's. He's instrumental in putting these webinars together. They've been fantastic. So thank you, Gary, for putting today's together. Emma Marseille. Emma is very much involved with COBRA. She project managers, and what we see today is largely thanks to her. Renee Klopper, Adam Craker of the IQ Business Group, and Tasneem Khan from Schindler's. So I'm going to hand over to you, Roger. It sounds like it's going to be one hell of an interesting presentation. And yeah, I encourage the audience to please ask questions. So as you go along, think of a question, post it on the Q&A, and we'll deal with the questions later. This is a webinar, so that's the idea. Please post the questions. Over to you, Roger.
Thanks so much, Maurice. And yeah, thank you so much for not only the opportunity to present, but also I think the initiative. The COBRA initiative is one that I think is timely. It is a great response to something that, I mean, I know we've overheard the word unprecedented, but it probably is, one of those significant unprecedented times. And so it's a privilege to be able to share some time and some thoughts with you. And so we are going to really think today, and I echo what Maurice has said about the Q&A. I've got both the Q&A as well as the chat box open in front of me. So at any time, you're welcome to engage on those, because obviously the content we're going to talk about essentially is around leadership. And I think, if we obviously look at what's happening in the boardroom space and what's happened in the boardroom space in the last few years, and certainly in the last week, we've seen some interesting developments. We saw last week the delinquency for life for a certain ex-chair of SAA. And it means that actually the focus is starting to turn. So we've had a new Companies Act for almost 10 years, came into play in 2011. And it's interesting that a lot of the challenges are around leadership. And what the law does is it puts the focus on the role of the board. And so that's what we want to really talk about, what a board is and what it should do. And so some of this, in a sense, looks at some of the basics, and I'd like to explore some of those basics in a sense, because if I think about last week's ruling, one of the definitions, interesting, linked to delinquency is this concept of dereliction of duty. And if you look at the word dereliction, dereliction is about abandoning one's post. There's this interesting picture in the word abandoning one's post. And so we need to understand, well, what is the post of directorship? What does it actually mean to be a director? And we've also all heard, these quotes about crisis and opportunity. So close scrutiny will show that most crisis situations are opportunities to either advance or stay where you are. A metaphor that I've used and a picture that I've used with a number of our clients is to say that what we're going through now isn't a crossroads. For instance, the way ahead doesn't exist anymore in the way that we knew it to be. It's a T-junction. It's we've got to choose one of different directions. And in our businesses, that choice and that decision rests on the leadership of the organization. And that's why the role of the board is absolutely critical, because we can't stay where we are. We have to move forward. And that's the space, what the space that Sirdar is in, is we're in what we call the boardroom space. We talk to directors in their individual capacity, the person of the director, their role, understanding how that works in a board scenario, and we're going to unpack a bit of that. So the composition of the board, how we put the board together, and then obviously a board has to act. And so the key thing about acting is the applied methodology. The things we do at board level is another area to engage around. But ultimately, all three of those, the person of the director, the team of the board, the things we do in the boardroom, are only ever about the company's performance. And so we define that as well by saying, and these are the questions to start thinking about in your own companies, is how are you defining effectiveness right now? Previous webinar I did was about finding or rediscovering your true north. What is effectiveness? Because effectiveness in the current environment and for the next year probably doesn't look like much profitability and much growth in your business. It's probably surviving and thriving, as we've said in terms of this. So you need to sit and say, how do you define effectiveness, and do you have the right team sitting around the table to be accountable for that effectiveness? And that's the bridge, in a sense, to thinking about the board. And then, is what you're doing sustainable? Is it long term? Is it in the interests of all parties in the company? And that's one of the underlying philosophies around business rescue. Business rescue is, in a sense, about the word rescue. And rescue is about sustainability. And that's why I think it's a really pertinent topic, is to say, well, what is the role of the board in the rescue of a business during this time? So that's a thought on that. But if we think and we go back to basics, is to ask the question, well, why, what, and how about a boardroom? Why do boards exist? What are the different purposes for a board? And that coming out again of last week's ruling, delinquency. Why was she found delinquent? It was because she didn't fulfill the role that the law requires of her, or required of her, as a director. And we need to examine ourselves and our teams to ask, do we understand the why of the board, what the board actually should do, and then how do we actually make sure the board does the right thing? And a good place to start is to say that in any business, there are three fundamental perspectives on a business. All right. And these three perspectives are recognized in the legal framework that we operate in, the Companies Act, as well as all the guides of governance and all of those kind of things. And the first one is obviously an investment perspective. People invest in companies, either their own businesses or other businesses, or get involved in businesses because they want to create a valuable asset. And so part of the role of the board is to say, how do we also, what is the role that we play in that as well? And again, in today's crisis, what does that actually mean? What does a valuable asset look like in the midst of a crisis? The second perspective, and it's normally when businesses start, it completely overlaps. The investment perspective is the same group of people who have also what I call the operational perspective. So how do we do that? How do we create the valuable asset? And normally as businesses grow and expand and start building value, those two roles start to drift apart. And a third perspective becomes more important, and that's the why we exist and what we aim to achieve, which is what I call the strategic perspective. And so we have the investment perspective effectively belonging to shareholding, operational belonging to effectively management, and the strategic perspective that emerges as businesses grow is really the perspective that a board needs to take on on a company. And a board needs to take on the context that the company is going through. Because maybe you've worked and fixed a lot of the operational issues in your business, or you're looking at, how do you raise the money or raise funding, and possibly that's why you are entering into and involved in, together with COBRA. But it's ultimately the why and the what we aim to achieve, the effectiveness, which is going to pull companies through this crisis. And over time, these tend to separate. They also tend to reorder over time. And the reordering is that the strategic perspective becomes the hub around which the investment perspective and the operational perspectives revolve. Because you need this engagement between the shareholding perspective, which is effectively, if one thinks about it, the shareholding perspective on a business is very much a what's in it for me, and legitimately so. It's very much a what am I getting out of this? In other words, the focus is more often on the person of the shareholder, or the entity of the shareholder, than the company itself. The operational perspective is almost the perspective that is lost in the busyness and the noise of the business, because that's the accountability there. The strategic perspective is the one that ties the two together in these different ways. So the shareholding perspective is essentially an outside-in perspective on a business. So you may be all three. You may have, you may what we call wear all three of these hats. But when you're sitting in your shareholder's seat, you're looking at it from the outside in as an investor. You're asking the question, what's in it for me? And as I said, quite legitimately so. The management or operations perspective is from the inside. It's saying, from the inside out, what are we doing? And are we guided by the way the business is run and the policy framework we operate in to do what we need to do to keep this thing going? And so there are lots of very short-term cycles, daily, weekly, monthly. And the middle perspective is the board's perspective on the whole business. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges that many board members or many leaders in business have at the moment, is that it's because of the nature of a crisis. What tends to happen is two things. Firstly, our strategic horizon goes to the immediate. Again, legitimately so. I'm not criticizing any of this, because we need to fix and make sure that we can keep going. And a lot of we've had to make big decisions about cutting costs, possibly downsizing, all of those different kind of challenging immediate decisions. All right. And so the other part of our perspective could be that we're looking from the outside in and we're saying, well, what's going on with this thing? I've invested in it. Is it going to actually survive? Is it going to do what I intended it to do from a shareholding point of view? And the board perspective ties those together, because the perspective of a board must be on the entire company. I always like to use the illustration of the board being the captain of the ship. And so the captain of the ship would probably know some of the technical and probably have experience working in ships for a long time, but probably doesn't know technically how every single part of the ship works. Other people do that. But what the captain of the ship does know is how all the parts of the ship work together to move towards the destination that they are aiming for. And that's the perspective of the board. It's not every single area of your business, but it's understanding how the whole thing fits together in order to move forward. And so the big leadership decision at the moment could be saying, do we have the right group of people sitting around the table that sees the whole of the business? You see, two things happen in board meetings, essentially. Is if the board meeting is dominated by the shareholder perspective or the investment perspective, it becomes an argument about who has the most power. And that power, in inverted commas, is linked to shareholding. And that's often what happens in a crisis. People are concerned about the value that they have built, or the value that is at risk. If the business is going well and things are operating well, often what happens is the discussion goes down into micromanaging the operations. And obviously in a crisis, we have a bit of both of those tensions, because we're focusing on both asset value as well as operations. And so the big thing about a board that sits in the middle and to look at the whole thing is, do we have the right team that can do that? And I want to unpack some ideas around that, but it's also premised on a concept that I came across in the last couple of years. So I'm an avid reader. I was, until 3 months ago, traveling, spending at least a couple of days on aeroplanes and a few nights traveling to different parts of the African continent, which was an incredible privilege. But I've always read, and I look at things in different ways. And one of the thoughts that the concepts that I came across that I thought this is really powerful, because it helps us make sense of how we put a board together and how we put a governance structure together. And this concept is one that is known as the Law of Requisite Variety. And you'll get to why I'm touching on this in a few minutes' time. It was promulgated by a guy called Ross Ashby. He was a biologist, and he was dealing with biological systems. And what was interesting, what we're seeing in a crisis is sometimes we need to learn from other sectors and other areas of knowledge. And so I was reading this, and he's speaking about homeostasis, and homeostasis being the way in which complex biological systems in changing environments over time succeed in creating or maintaining critical variables within tightly defined limits. So life for a biological system is about managing homeostasis, an environment that is changing all the time, and the own ability to adapt and change to that. And when I started reading this, I thought, well, this applies quite strongly to organizations, because how it's phrased on two levels, this law of requisite variety. The first level is to say, for a system to be stable, the number of states that its control mechanism is capable of attaining. So there's an assumption that every system has a control mechanism that controls it, obviously. But for the system itself to be stable, the control mechanism must have a higher level of variety than the number of states in the system being controlled. So let me rephrase that with a company in mind. So for a company to be stable, the number of states that its board, because the law assumes that the board is controlled, the authority to run a company is given to the board collectively. So the number of states that its board is capable of attaining must be greater than or equal to the number of states in the company being controlled. And that's why one of the principles at board level is, do you have the right mixture of skills to understand the scope of your business? And that's why boards become critical when either the business changes. So have things changed in your business? And this could be a positive or a negative thing. So let's think positively. So over time, a business grows and develops and expands, but the same group of people continually direct it. One has to ask the question, does that control mechanism, that board, that team of leaders actually have the requisite variety to look after this entity that is growing and diversifying over time? We often see that in groups of companies, often family businesses that over diversify, become challenged by the fact that they have a whole range of businesses that they don't necessarily have the right perspective on. And so that's the internal, the control mechanism, the board understanding the company. Now, obviously the negative is, how has your business been changed in this crisis? How has this crisis put stresses and strains on different aspects of your business? Maybe your business has had to shrink. Maybe your business has had to get rid of different parts of it. Maybe your business has had to restructure. Maurice and I were kind of talking just before as we were waiting and preparing, just around the challenge of adapting and incorporating an online mechanism for sales, delivery, purchase. I mean, he mentioned drones and all those kind of things. I mean, that's part of the business model going forward, is how's your business got to change into the future? Remember, we're not at a crossroads. The future, the road doesn't lie ahead anymore. It lies in certain directions. And so that relates to the second part of requisite variety. So there's this internal aspect, and secondly, there's this inside out aspect or outside in aspect. So if a system is to be able to deal successfully with the challenges or the diversity of challenges that its environment produces. So here, let's talk about a company. If a company is able to deal successfully with the diversity of challenges that its environment produces, and the diversity of challenges the environment has produced in the last few months and is going to continue to produce in the next few months and possibly years, are massive. So for the system to deal successfully, it needs to have a repertoire of responses which is at least as nuanced as the problems thrown up by the environment. And so again, this has to be about, do you have the right, not just the team and control mechanism for the system, the company, but what are you doing in your businesses? What decisions are you taking in your businesses to make sure that you are taking into account some of the challenges? And I think that's almost a very safe word in the time we're going through. So a viable system is one that can handle the variability of its environment. Only variety can absorb variety. And I will go so far as to say that based on the law of requisite variety, the variety in your leadership team is going to be absolutely critical to the variety in your company. And remember, the decisions in the leadership of your organization and on the company of your organization are going to determine whether you are successful. You can build, develop, expand the repertoire of responses necessary for the next few years, as we work our way through and out of this crisis. And so when one thinks about building a company based on this, one has to ask the two questions. How does one cope with variety? So there are two ways one does this. In coping with variety, you either reduce the variety, and that's part of a conversation we're not going to have today, which is about systematizing your business. So what do the systems in your business actually look like? Are they able to handle the variety, and do they reduce the variety to a manageable extent? I had a meeting even earlier this morning with a colleague, and he was just saying, there's just so much happening. And I'm saying, well, let's try to reduce that by systematizing what we can. Control the controllables has been our kind of mantra in Sirdar over the last 3 months. Control the controllables, manage the variety by systematizing appropriately. The second part, which we are going to pick up on, is increasing the variety. So in your leadership team, you need to be saying, how do you deal with the complexity, the systems approach or the complexity approach, which we are expected to at the moment? And that's composing a board. Because ultimately, if we think about the entire business, if we look at the different elements of a business, performance ultimately comes from the combination of your systems and your people in the business. And so the variety in your business is based on how well designed your systems are and how well how you've increased and got the right team of people to be able to see the whole and bring to the table the repertoire of responses, the requisite variety necessary at the moment. So that's some foundation stones, I think, which lay some challenges and some challenging questions in terms of saying, well, how do we then put a board together? And what does a board look at in this time? And I love this quote because it also bridges to saying, well, the challenge at the moment is we can all find lots of information and we're all swamped with information. There are some fantastic articles out there, these webinars that are just incredible. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of information. A lot of companies have been incredibly generous in terms of saying, let's give away what we know into this crisis. But the same thing doesn't apply to everybody. So we're all going through the same storm, but we're definitely not in the same boat. The best thing for your business is to do the best thing for your business. And that's what we want to think about. What are the components of thinking about that at board level? And as we go, I'm happy to get questions or comments as we go as well, because that's will help. And so as I talk about some of these elements of composing a board, please feel free to drop a question into the Q&A box or the chat box as we go. Key thing about a board is that firstly, every seat is precious. And too often we've gone into boardrooms and there are people who are sitting in a seat simply because they feel it's their right. It's their, they've always sat in that seat. There was the debate last year or the year before with, Christo Visa and the Checkers board. Interestingly enough, it was one where he had secured his board seat effectively through the shareholding structure, a whole lot of technicalities, but essentially he was saying, well, I've been here forever, and it was almost 40 years, I think. And eventually there was such a kind of, don't want to say necessarily revolt, but it's the word that comes to mind, that he said, well, actually, okay, I need to hand over. Because ultimately, if someone is not contributing everything they can contribute in the best interest of the company, a seat is wasted. And so you need to think about what the right number of seats is, but also every seat is precious. And so there are two perspectives or two ways of looking at composing a board. The one I call from the outside in and addresses some of the things that we're quite familiar with, different types of directors, etc. The second deals with a perspective inside out, which asks the question, what should each one of those directors be bringing to the table anyway? And so let's start with the outside in one, which is, the more technical, the more descriptive, the more observer-based approach, which is looking at different types of directors and what we should be looking for in the different types of directors. I know So directors have lots of different names. There are obviously the distinction between executive and non-executive, which is the first simple one. But then we also get labels like shadow directors and, representative directors. But ultimately, if we look at the codes of corporate governance, there are a few key principles that I'm going to just illustrate. So I'm going to use a pen on the screen to illustrate, and say, well, what if we think about the different types of directors? What are some of the guidelines we should be thinking about? And so the guidelines, the likes of the King IV Code of Corporate Governance, the UK codes, most of the international guidelines around boards. And remember, this isn't the legislation. This is an ideal looking at the best board possible that can act in the best interest of the companies. And so one of the words that is used a lot is this concept of independence. And ultimately, it starts by every board member needing to be able to think independently. But that's an inside-out thing. We'll touch on that now. The reality is, from the outside in, we can look and say, well, the recommendation is that the majority of a board are independent. So independent, and an independent director is by definition a non-executive director. And so these would be executive directors. And so that's why I put 5 people here, because if the majority are non-executives and the majority of the non-executives are independent, that's essentially a blueprint looking from the outside in to say, well, that's what and again, it's an objective, it's an aim. It's not required by law. That's important. But if we're thinking about the construction of our board, we've got to ask the question, are there people who give a perspective from the outside in? And remember that all directors are equal. So all directors are equal in the eyes of the law. There's no distinction in liability between all of these people, but there's certainly a difference in terms of what they bring to the table. And so your distinction here, your executive directors would typically be your MD, your FD, all right? And the idea is they would essentially be the conveyors of the operational perspective. And they would often have more access to the operational information in their management roles that they would then bring to the board. But remember, on a board, those executives are board members. There's no distinction. They're not an inferior or superior type of director because you happen to be an executive director. The idea is they bring to the table the operational inside-out perspective to help. The second perspective is the non-executive director perspective, which sits outside the operations of the business. And that's split, as we said, into an independent branch and a non-independent branch. And so the distinction between those is that an independent director effectively has only one relationship with the company, and that is as a director. A non-executive who's not independent could have another relationship with the company. They could be a shareholder. They could be related to someone involved in the business on an executive basis. They could have recently been involved in the business. So you can see that the outside-in perspective is a bit technical, but it's aimed at getting the right mix of people around the table. But it's actually quite a shallow indicator of whether these people are actually contributing. Technically, there are a lot of boards that have the right structure, but actually it's not about the technicalities of what type of director you are. It's actually what you bring to the table, what each person brings to the table or to the team. And that's an important concept, because a director doesn't sit there in their individual capacity alone. They sit there as part of a team. And it's an interesting concept, but in the law, the assumption is that a company is led by a team of people. So we often focus leadership on the individual leader. And we read books about the individual leaders, and we can all think about that and remember and recognize those people. But actually, team leadership is critical. And it's important for each person to understand that they are playing a role on a team, and the team is structured for the best interests of the company. So an example was the Steinhoff board. The Steinhoff board had probably, and it was referred to as a blue chip board, it had probably some of the most qualified, experienced business people in South Africa on it. The challenges, and this is my perspective and my opinion, is they were a group of individuals. They weren't a team of players acting in the best interest of the company. And we've all heard a lot of it coming out of that. But that's the challenge, is to ask the question. And remember, the requisite variety sits in your team as a whole, not just in the individuals. And so if we ask the question, what does the team have to bring to the table? There's this core element, so I'm going to build a set of concentric circles that build it. Is to say, at the core, every single board member needs to be aligned in two key things. The two areas they need to be aligned in is they need to be aligned in terms of the values. And remember, these are alignment with the organizational values. So this is the organizational culture conversation that says, have we as a board understood what the organizational values are, and do we reflect those? Do we carry those? We see that very strongly in the likes of King 3, King 4, huge emphasis on ethics and effectiveness. So it's about being effective as a director, but it's also about being ethical. One of the big words in King 4 is integrity. And so a lot of those concepts, that's one of the reasons we're looking at these boards that have been running a lot of our SOEs and saying, well, is there integrity? But it's not only exclusively the public companies. We've also got our fair share of private companies that are also challenged from our values. And obviously the expectation is the highest level of values. Integrity being one of the key principles of governance, that we're acting with integrity, and that would include honesty, transparency, all of those different things. But it's also important, and what I've got there under core skills, is that every director knows how to direct. So the danger is people are often put into a position of directorship because they've done well in another context. They've either done well in the management structure of a team and the operations, and so they get promoted, and they get promoted to being a director. And often they're not told that this is a quantum leap between running an operational portion of the business and viewing the whole and seeing the whole. Often people get, put onto boards because they're connected with someone. I mean, that was the challenge I think we had with SAA and some of the SOEs, is there's a connectedness reason, whereas actually the primary thing is that directors must be able to direct. Around that, it's important to say, well, what's next? What do we then look for in the combination? So everybody brings values and core skills to the table. Obviously, everybody has to bring a set of specialist skills to the table, because we're not expecting everybody to be equally qualified. This was the example of the Steinhoff board was stark, because the majority of the board members were actually CAs, and yet the company was involved in some of the most convoluted financial engineering we've seen. This is one of the challenges, is that, do we have the right mixture of skills? If we have too many of one type of skills, we're going to drop the ball in another area. Okay, and how do we find this? So when we think about the specialist skills in our board, we can obviously look at the standard ones, but actually we need to look at, there are three key areas that I like to look at in terms of specialist skills. And each of the words starts with an S anyways, to help you remember. Firstly, we've got to understand the sector the business is in. That's obvious. But the challenge is we need to get the right mix, because there should be an assumption that the executive directors carry the most sector experience. That's what they bring to the table. We don't want to just put a whole lot of people from the same sector into the board, because we need a spread, especially if the company is wanting to do different things. In a crisis, we need as broad an experience as possible, because we may be learning from other sectors as well. So sector's one. Secondly, stage of the business. As businesses grow, they obviously expand, and they grow in different ways. But every stage is different. I worked with a company a few years ago. They were in the construction space. They were kind of maybe a third tier construction company doing really well. They had gone to get advice, and it was in the time when everybody wanted ultimately to list their companies. And so they were given the advice, find yourself an ex-listed CEO of a construction company, which they did. The problem is it almost destroyed their company, simply because the gentleman who came on board knew nothing about how to take a company from where it was through the next stages of the journey. They were a very successful listed company CEO, but they just didn't understand. And so there was a huge disconnect between the two shareholders who were effectively appointing their first CEO and trying to put their first steps in place. And one of the processes we went through was actually to downsize, shrink a bit, and to reconsolidate. And as of last year, I don't know how they're doing at the moment, but as of last year, they were doing incredibly successfully. This was 5 or 7 years later, because they'd re-looked at the right kind of specialist skills. based on the stage of the company. So maybe a family business going through a 3rd to 4th generation transition, it'll be helpful for them to find an independent director who's been through that transition already. All right. And so maybe it's the growth, it's the size, it's the complexity of the business. And then the third element, so we have sector, we have stage of the business, and then obviously strategy. And this is where you need to be thinking really deeply about what are the things you're going to have to engage with over the next 12 to 24 to 36 months. And probably many businesses have to be engaging more robustly with digitization or technology. And the danger is we can get swept away and sold a whole lot of things that are actually not going to be meaningful to our businesses. So bringing that capability, that knowledge onto the board may be something that is really helpful to help you navigate the next stage in the strategy of the business as well. Maybe it's expansion, maybe it's downsizing, maybe your business has only ever grown and now you need to shrink. All right. Maybe you need someone who's been through that, who understands the complexity of that, sitting around the table. And this is obviously where there are different specialist skills. So while everybody has the first two, the middle two, each person must bring a specialist skill to the table. And the reason it's also important to identify this is because it's important to understand who you have and who you don't have. Because remember, if you have a skill set missing, that doesn't automatically mean you need another board member. But what it means is you can bring that skill set into the boardroom. Maybe there's someone on your team who is an IT guru who can help you go through that process before only bringing a board member on. So think about the matrix, the skills matrix you need at board level to oversee the whole company going forward. Then there's an interesting next circle, and it's the circle which has typically been called diversity. And it's one of those challenging words. As I mentioned, I've worked throughout different countries in Africa. And what I realized quite early on, traveling for the last 10 years, is this word diversity means a different thing in different contexts. And so I often mention that, and I say, I'm from South Africa and it has quite a specific context here. Go north of the border, and interestingly enough, it shifts. North of the border, there's more interest in the gender mix of a board than here in South Africa. Obviously, it's the racial mix, and without getting into details around that. But I think the key thing about diversity, though, is it's not about the identity of the person. It's about the perspective they bring to the board. Now, I'm not denying that we need to think about the requirements, and so please don't get me wrong here, but we need to be asking the question, how do we actually identify the right perspectives in our business? And maybe the perspective in your business you've been missing. So another example, so one of the big clothing retailers a few years ago, I won't say their name, but they're the one that started with T. They didn't do very well a few years ago, and in their financial results, they published their board, who is their board. And interestingly enough, there were a few challenges to this board because, number one, all of the board members except one were men, clothing retailer. All of the board members except one were well over the age of 50. And all of the board members except one were white. And so you had this board of, old white men, and you had one younger, she was in her 40s, and she was a black lady who was involved on this board. And I just thought the performance of the business reflects that who's sitting there who's buying the clothes, okay? And I'm not saying we get customers all over the board and we get everybody, but where is the perspective coming from? And so we need to understand that each company needs different perspectives on it. All right. And that's age. It's obviously social economic class. It's obviously the things I've mentioned, men and women. For the ladies out there, it's been proven without doubt that boards with women on them do better profitably and in a profitability wise and also sustainability wise. And so there's no argument anymore for just male dominated boards. If you thinking that's where I'm coming from, I think it's about getting the mix. The danger is we shift to another extreme and suddenly our diversity goes out the window on the other end of the equation. The bottom line is we must be sitting with people sitting around the boardroom table who are different to us, because it's not about us, it's about the company that we direct. And if we look at the third, so there's one final circle, and we use a specific tool in Sirdar, but whether you use this tool or use another one, it's important to think about that the personality mix around the table. And again, it's related to the other areas. It's not specifically different, but what we find is that different types of people tend to do different things, but the personalities of people are different as well, the learning styles, the perspectives, the communication styles of people. So we often joke in Sirdar, because we have what's called too much activating energy. And so this is the base of the tool we use. It's called the contribution compass, and it measures, and it's similar to your Myers-Briggs. It's similar to a lot of those, but the idea is you want a mix of people around a boardroom table. You don't only want one type of personality, because then you tend to have lots of one kind of conversations and none of the other kinds of conversations. And so the tool we use, it measures 4 what I call buckets of energy, and each one of us have a bit in all of these. Activating energy, getting things going; sustaining energy, keeping things going. All right. Inspiring energy, working with others very well and thinking together, working things out as a team together. Tempering or refining energy is the refinement through analysis and precision. And each of these different buckets of energy determine who we are as a person. And so the profiling tool, as many do, identifies the mix of energies and gives each person a label, although it's not about the label, it's about the mix of energies. And then what we want to do on a board is we want to make sure that there is a mix of people around the boardroom table. All right. If you have a board, and this is what often happens, entrepreneurial boards tend to be clustered in this area, which means you'll probably be having some conversations very deeply and expanding on some things. But what about the stuff that sits here? The analysis, the depth. And so balancing a board. And so the principle is, in a business, so in the operations of a business, where there are legitimately silos, you can have clusters of different types of personalities. But as you move up a business, and especially at board level, you want to get as balanced a team as possible. So this same principle would apply at your senior management team, is you want to get the right mix of people sitting around the table. And as I said, whether you use this tool or another tool, it's important to think about all of the different, perspectives. And so those circles are really saying, because again, it's about the mix. So if we construct a board and we construct it with requisite variety in mind, it's a key thing to say, what does your company need? Because remember, all of this is not about you, it's about the company. Okay, the company is a separate legal entity, and this combination serves the company and not the other way around. And I think what often happens is we get it the wrong way around. We put the board members together, and then we say we hope that they will be able to govern the company, instead of saying, what does the company need? And that's, really in the last few minutes, I want to be saying, well, what are some of the perspectives? And this is where some questions or comments. And yeah, I saw this will be on video. And I'm also happy through COBRA, you can get in touch with us as well, and we're happy to share some of these concepts with you as well. In terms of going forward and thinking, 3 things, and Maurice, maybe this is a good place to reflect a bit and say, well, with this in mind, the perspectives right now that are critical are going to be a strategic perspective, looking forward, lifting your eyes. So you may have gone to the immediate. Now it's saying, well, how do you unpack the future going forward? Absolutely essential. Reminding the company of the values. So we saw this quite strongly with the EdCon scenario early on in the crisis, where there was this tussle of values, as who do we pay? And we saw the emotional response. And sometimes board members need to be saying, no, but are we acting in alignment with our values? It's not only about where we want to go, but it's also about what do we believe to be right and what do we believe to be true. It's also engaging with stakeholders and saying, broadly speaking, who are we related to? And thinking about, do we engage properly? Because I believe that there is going to be a reconfiguration of some businesses and sectors, and it's going to be in partnership with other parties, other players in your environment. And so who do you actually speak to? How do you think about that strategically as well? Risk is massive. If you're not able to think systematically through risk, because risk is one of those things we're ultimately terrified of. And so what we do is we shy away from it instead of saying, well, we actually need to take risks. The law assumes that as a director, you're taking risks, but it wants you to do it, to take risks as responsibly as possible. And so thinking about risk is a critical perspective as well. And then really, as we said, the requisite variety. Those are the key perspectives we believe that are emerging at the moment. Second thing is the disciplines that a board we believe will bring to the table right now, especially when things are uncertain. One of the things that a regular board process does is it brings what we call a rhythm or a cadence to the company. And this is where often when we've worked over the years with, especially entrepreneurial businesses, they often don't have the rhythm is determined by the opportunities. Instead of saying there's a tension between the internal and the external rhythm of the business. And what the board does by meeting every second month or third month at the most, it sets a rhythm for decision making, because the decisions have to be made. And obviously there are exceptions, but we build the rhythm of thinking so we're not just continually responding. And as we build the rhythm of thinking strategically, we are thinking ahead to what we need to respond to, is to just responding in the present to what's happening, which does help clarify the thinking and discussions. So really important to maybe, and these are some diagnosis tools for you, is to ask the question, what conversations have you been having and what conversations haven't you been having? Where do you drift into the habit as a team and talk endlessly about some things and skip over other things? Because the clarity of thinking is also brought into to the fore with a good board process and good board disciplines. It's also, and I know these are a range of ideas, but it's also the objectivity, the looking from the outside in, but also being vested in. So this is especially the difference between an independent director and a business advisor. So a business advisor is outside the business giving advice into the business. And they would structure it in such a way, or should, so that the decision is left to the board member, because the liability will sit with the board. With an independent director, you often have the same perspective. The person who sits outside and gives an outside perspective, but they are as vested in the decision as the fellow directors around the table. And that sounds like a technicality, but it's actually quite a strong psychological impact on the business, because there's a sharing of risk between the insiders and the outsiders. And I'm putting those very seriously in inverted commas, which also means that accountability for performance tends to go up, because it's not just the people who are in the business or invested in the business who are trying to do things. Because if we just those people, we often, I always say we judge other people by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. Other people by their actions, ourselves by our intentions. And so it's very difficult for me to hold myself accountable. Let me be honest. I mean, that's the challenge we all have. But if I'm answerable to someone else, then it's easier for there to be accountability for performance. I'm, prone to say, well, I'm not willing to be held accountable for that because I don't think it's doable. Whereas actually, if I do commit to something and I'm held accountable, it improves. And so it's also being thinking about, what are we achieving? So the accountability and the strategy are important, but also the accountability and the impact. What do we leave behind in our businesses? And so those are two things. Those are the perspectives, the strategic, the stakeholders, the risk, and some of the disciplines that a board would bring to the table. And so, Maurice, it would be great if you could come. Maybe any questions that you have, any questions that anybody out there has, will be great for us to reflect on in the last few minutes. Thanks.
I'd just like to hop in and reinforce practically everything you've said. I've been working on a project which involves analyzing boards and what would constitute the ideal board. And I'll show you what I've put together, because there's actually science. There's science behind, if you can stop your screen, there's science behind everything you just said. So have a look at what I found as part and parcel of this project. Let me share my screen. So it's about the wisdom of the board, as I call it. And I found this formula. It's by some mathematicians, Yale University, and the way it works is that it'll hold true, and only if the following inequality holds, and we've got the formula. This inequality provides an explicit testable condition to determine whether a board is wise. Now have a look at this. That's what's required: limited influence, diversity, independence, and aggregation. And that's literally what you've taken us through today.
Yep.
And there it is. It's science.
Yeah.
It's before your eyes. And what's interesting, you know,
fortunately, I have a son who's an actuary, so he can tell me what the mathematical thing means. Okay, great. Carry on.
But what's interesting is, you know, we've had to do a deep dive into the limited influence and what's meant there, and diversity. And you know, you say diversity has a different meaning in different contexts and in different geographical regions. But for this formula to work, diversity has to actually be extreme diversity. So it's at a board level, you actually do need diversity. You need the CA on the one side and somebody who represents the complete polar opposite of the spectrum. And that's what makes this formula work. And if you don't pin down limited influence, diversity, independence, and aggregation, independence as an example, it's independence where and limited influence. Things like a secret ballot, okay? Actually, then when it comes to, let's say, contentious votes, it's actually important to look at that to drive the limited influence and the independence in this formula. So I thought I'd share that with you.
No, excellent. Thank you. No, I think
because it's all there, and this is the formulas found by. And
I'm going to take a photo of that, if you don't mind.
No, please.
Sounds like it's. No, that's fascinating.
I look forward to discussing this with you, because it's interesting. You've just given a perspective, but the perspective is all there. And incidentally, this has been shown to work since 1907. It's uncontroversial since 1907. So I look forward to that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great. Thank you. Thanks Adam, also for just it's a privilege, and we're taking forward obviously and helping, and this will be one of the questions that I'm going to ask COBRA, is to say, what is the requisite variety for the COBRA board? And those are some of the questions that I have been throwing at you. So thank you for this opportunity, and if there are any other questions, and if you need to get hold of us, you're welcome to do so through COBRA.
As mentioned before we conclude, I was very, very involved in Dudu Mnyeni's the saga that took place whilst Kalawe was the CEO. And I was involved in what was going down there with the Airbus deal, and if I tell you, it was astonishing. I'd never seen anything like that before and since, and it certainly wasn't an uphill battle. For her to be declared delinquent. I don't know if you saw, but they actually abandoned the remainder of their case because they were so strong on the initial grounds. So like, it
was so obvious. It was so obvious. Which I think is interesting from a legal. I mean, you're the lawyer. From a legal perspective, is what do you do when something is so obvious? But there's a couple of questions that have come up, so I just want to touch on. Thank Nick. This presentation was positioned as to what a board should do in COVID. With all of this, it's appropriate to absolutely. I mean, what I've spoken about, what Maurice has shared with you, applies all the time. But it's continually thinking about your board, and remember, the key perspective of the board is the future. It's not what the company has done, it's what the company wants to do in the future. And so the reconstruction, recomposition, reworking of the board has to be about the next cycle, which is the next 3 to 5 years in a company. And then I'm going to just copy this. There's one, Teresa, I'm going to copy what you've said. There's a whole thing here, if I can. Can we save the question somewhere? Because there's a she just said I must get hold of her, so we'll just get that. I'll just take a photo of it again, and I'll send you.
We'll have that. We'll
okay, all right. I'm never 100% sure how things work on this. I normally just copy. Any other questions or comments? Any thoughts from your side, Maurice, as we?
I think we were talking delinquency, and I think what's also was quite interesting about the Mnyeni judgment is that the business judgment rule, was actually reinforced. And that is that, so long as you're bona fide and in your decisions, a director can make foolish decisions without getting into trouble. But it's about the bona fides. And that was key in Mnyeni judgment. The moment you cross that and there's self-interest involved and the conflicts involved, that's when you fall foul of the law. And they've actually found that delinquency is in the public interest. It's actually a public interest statutory provision.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fascinating. I would love to have a conversation with you about that as well.
Yeah,
Lots of things in there.
I think that's a wrap. I don't know if there are any further questions. No, that's it. So yeah, thanks so much, Roger. Thanks so much to the panelists. Thanks to the COBRA partners for making this happen. We have COBRA partners joining literally on a daily basis, literally welcoming the COBRA partners on a daily basis. So welcome, guys. And please bear in mind, this is a daily show. We're on at 10 every day. We also have, tomorrow we have 2 shows on at 10 and at 3 o'clock. All the shows are on the COBRA website, www.cobra.org.za. If you have any questions, please just email info@cobra.org.za and somebody will get back to you immediately. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you very much. Until tomorrow. Bye-bye.